cloud. All right, Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in this evening. I am delighted to see names of some distant friends or friends I haven't seen in a while who are taking advantage of the ability to connect at a distance. Even though I do miss in-person meeting and the opportunity to see feedback, the body language of people, that is very helpful to me as a speaker. That the short title of tonight's topic is industrial policy, but those two words capture only a small part of a much broader and more complex set of issues. That was underscored to me as I looked for someone else to address this topic. And the response was, in their declining of the invitation, was that this was far broader than their own areas of expertise. So being undaunted by the breadth and depth of the issues, I welcome the opportunity to learn more about it myself. That the workbook article, for those of you who have read the article in the Great Decisions Workbook by Jonathan Chanis, is pretty good, and it identifies a great many components of what is subsumed under the issues of industrial policy that I've used in my construction of my talk, the longer title in the workbook, which is Foreign Policy, the Economy, and Industrial Policy. Because I think to understand the current debate and what shapes both the issues, the perceptions of the issues, and the debate, it's important to have an appreciation for the international relations, international environment dimensions, foreign policy, security policy, and the state of our domestic economy. And then as that provides the context for debate over industrial policy. That said, and before I make everything more complex, I think this core issue under the industrial policy heading is, what role should the federal government play in guiding the economy? This is a long-standing and always very contentious issue in American politics. It goes all the way back to the first decades of our republic. Among the most intense of the debates were in the run-up to the Civil War. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln, when he was a Whig, before he became a Republican, was one of the leading champions of a larger role for the federal government in building infrastructure, back at a time when infrastructure meant canals and roads. The idea was that building infrastructure would facilitate economic growth and unite all parts of the country. The debate in the United States in some ways is surprising, because going back to Adam Smith's seminal work, determinative work, The Wealth of Nations, the championing of capitalist market economics, the date of that publication is exactly the same as the birthday of our country, 1776. So the ideas have been around a long time. And as Adam Smith pointed out then, the private sector does not build infrastructure. That is one of the functions that requires government intervention. But the evolution of the issue in our country has gone through a range of specific issues, including child labor, that were children the property of their parents, and did parents ultimately have say about whether children should be in school or used to generate income for the family. It was a long fight. It was opposed for decades before child labor laws came into effect. Worker safety laws, length of the workday. All of these have to do with dimensions of industrial policy, role of government in the economy. Now, in the current version of this ongoing debate, it's moved even further beyond the traditional bounds or definitions of infrastructure to include childcare, that to enable more people, notably women, but just more people in general, to enter the workforce or to remain in the workforce. Safety issues, health and safety issues, environmental issues, and most recently, issues of equity and social justice. The rich getting richer, the poor remaining poor, or becoming wealthier at a much slower rate, is now a very contentious issue. And again, it's at the heart of the debate over what the role of government should be in managing the economy. The economic and social issues are complicated enough, but they're further complicated by politics, partisan politics in particular, but also the politics of money. Changes in legislation that have shifted far more political power to those capable of making very large campaign contributions. Ideology, the stigmatizing of positions with language, that industrial policy is characterized by many on mostly one side of the debate in the United States as a manifestation of socialism, or even worse, of communism. And therefore, no need to debate the merits or possible advantages of certain modifications to our current structures and systems and regulation and legislation, because any change is denounced as a manifestation of communism, and who wants to be in favor of communism? And finally, vested interests, that we from the beginning of the nation have enabled, allowed, authorized the federal government to intervene in the economy in different ways. Now it's manifest everything from subsidies to agriculture, which is done in part in the name of holding down food costs for everybody, but directs the vast majority of the subsidies to very large agribusinesses. Depletion allowances for hydrocarbon oil companies and the like. The building of infrastructure that benefits some industries and some locales more than others, where ports, where railroads and so forth are constructed. Those who benefit are reluctant to give up the benefits in order to achieve greater equity or greater environmental protection, or to make a smaller carbon footprint in the effort to reduce man-made climate change. All of these factors are at play, and others, and I will try and weave many of them together in this explication this evening. But let me begin by clarifying or expanding upon the points I've made already. A core issue here related to the role of government is the size of government. Big government or small government? What should the range of government responsibilities be? What authorities should be granted to the government for regulation, for monitoring, for policing, for enforcing regulations? In order to do all of the things that could be considered necessary to an industrial policy or a more robust industrial policy or a more equitable and effective industrial policy, is more people, more government experts, specialists, or in the pejorative term, more government bureaucrats who only clog up the system and make counterproductive rules. Cost. More responsibilities, more authority, more people cost more. And costs are to be held down in almost all areas except national security. And finally, the size of government is related to intrusiveness. How much input and impact and insight should government have to private sector or local governments or individual families? And this is a way to illustrate one of the many, many intriguing or ironic contradictions in the current debate. Many of those who argue on theoretical or ideological terms that government has no role or a very limited role in managing the economy. Small government is best. Government should stay out of the affairs of people, are the same ones who argue for far more intrusive government regulation of everything from abortion to gender identity to religious practices on there, that one looks in vain for consistency across the positions articulated by individuals, by groups, by political parties, in part because consistency is not an independent objective. It's an artifact of pursuit of other interests for reasons other than being consistent. The size of government is related to debate over the scope of government authority and action. How narrow or broad should the government's writ of authority be? Can or should government be a part of the solution, or is it inherently a part of the problem? Ronald Reagan famously stated that government is the problem, not a part of the solution to any problem, in his characterization of it. There's a separate stream of thinking and argument that wants to limit government revenues, even if they want broader scope of government authority, and they're not particularly worried about the size of the government in terms of number of components to regulate. They want to hold down costs, leave money in the hands of the people, leave it in the hands of the private sector. The stereotypical, even cartoonish characterization of this is government is inherently inefficient. Inefficiency borders on or reflects incompetence. And the caricature of the corporate realm is that of much greater efficiency. And to get these conclusions depends on definition of what constitutes efficiency. Markets, the private sector, is far better than governments are for generating economic efficiency, highest return for lowest investment. But governments don't exist to achieve economic efficiency, don't exist in order to maximize profits. Government exists in order to facilitate economic activity and to smooth out the inequities, the damage to the environment, and other consequences of unbridled capitalist market approaches to maximizing efficiency. So there's an inherent tension that is there. Another strand in this has to do with backlash against globalization. Globalization as a shorthand term for the establishment of production and supply chains that transcend national borders, that bring in finished products and semi-finished goods and food and other resources from around the world. That the dramatic expansion of trade that has occurred in the last 3 decades and has increased prosperity around the world, dramatically so in many countries, but also in the United States. The United States has become very much richer in the last 4 decades, but most Americans haven't. That the country has become wealthier, but also the gap between rich and poor, or between middle class and very rich, has widened substantially. That economic inequality has become much more pronounced. That this is in part a consequence of outsourcing and global production, which allow for comparative advantage divisions of labor. They are, and if done properly, they're inherently more efficient. If they weren't more efficient, they wouldn't happen. The production chains would, and the outsourcing would not occur as it did. But it causes social discomfort, usually local. And here the broader contrast is between overall benefit, the benefit of the many, the benefit of the nation, the benefit of the global economy, compared to pain. And pain is almost always local. Closing the one factory in a town eliminates the employment that generates the taxes that support the government. It eliminates the money that people can spend in restaurants and shops on Main Street. These are little problems compared to the overall gigantic benefit, but they're problems that are the responsibility and the purview of governments. And they either do a good job or a bad job at managing the pain of relocating or retraining or compensating in some way for the consequences of greater efficiency. And finally, to repeat a point I made in my opening remarks, the use of politically charged labels. Markets are depicted as inherently and always superior to any type of planned economy, which is equated with socialist economies, which is equated with communist ideology, which is equated with the failed Communist Party-led states, beginning with the Soviet Union and those of of Central Europe. So if you can taint the very idea with a label, it's not necessary to defend or debate the advantages or disadvantages of particular approaches that might be subsumed under the label of industrial policy, where industrial policy is intended to both sustain growth, increase prosperity, achieve greater social justice, achieve greater equity, social equity, economic fairness, to protect the environment, have sustainable development, all of these desirable things that go under it. But it's also investments to ensure continued technological progress, which is correctly thought to be a pillar of American national strength, of our military strength, the attractiveness of our economic system, the leading by example, the soft power that we have utilized highly effectively for the last 70 years. These issues are not new, but they've gained a new salience, even a new urgency in the last decade, and particularly in the last 5 years. So the remainder of my talk will examine, I hope explain to some extent why that has happened, why these issues have been rekindled, given a new urgency, and how they are reflected in debates that are going on right now in our country, and not only in our country. So let me shift to the combination or concatenation of developments in the post-Cold War world that helped create the situation that has renewed interest in us taking a new look at the role of government in managing the economy. I should say right from the beginning that this section of my talk deserves a lot more time than I can devote to it. But I believe that the concise compression and the summaries that I will give here should be familiar to many of you who have participated in previous years' Great Decision series, that this should ring some bells for you. But of course, in the question and answer period, do not hesitate to ask for clarification. So what are some of the issues? And these are not in a strict order of chronological significance or absolute importance. But one of them, certainly an important one, is the demise of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, 1992, that cleared the way for much greater global interaction. And that global interaction was not neutral or not unconstrained. The global interaction has occurred primarily in the US dominated, initially referred to unipolar world after the end of the bipolar Cold War, US dominance, US hegemony, the US-led free world, liberal international rules-based order became far more important and expanded or became open, not just to the relatively few countries in the free world, US allies, plus China, which was admitted in 1979 to that rules-based system, but to everybody. That in what was rather inelegantly and unfortunately titled "The End of History" argument, linked to my friend Frank Fukuyama, title of First an Article, then a Book, where he was referring to the end of debate over the advantages of the communist planned heavy degree of control of the economic and social order in favor of the liberal Western market-based democratic system, that the US-led liberal order became the only game in town. That logically, that's probably not the case. Factually, it's probably not the case. But politically, it became the case that the countries that had attempted to pursue a neutralist foreign policy to avoid entanglement with either of the bloc leading superpowers through the decades of the Cold War, suddenly began a rush to enter in and participate and derive the benefits from what had been known as the free world system. As more places and more people became eligible and interested in participating in globalizing economies. During the Cold War, the lines of cleavage, the borders restricting interaction and pursuit of economic efficiency were pretty rigid, but they collapsed after 1992. So suddenly, more or less, the entire world was eligible to get into the game, to participate in international divisions of labor, to find their own comparative advantage, be it in labor or technology or capital or production of certain natural resources, that the number of pieces that could be combined and recombined in different ways was enormously greater. That by itself probably was insufficient to have changed the world. But it happened at the same time as the digital revolution, the information technology revolution, that's made it possible to subdivide production geographically. Through earlier stages of the Industrial Revolution, going back to the origins of the steam engine, if you wanted to produce sophisticated goods, you pretty much had to do it in one location, because you had a small number of skilled engineers who could set up the machinery used, train people in the use of it. So physical proximity was essential. Over time, it became concentrated in ever larger corporate structures. So it was no longer one or a few engineers, but it was engineering structures and manufacturing structures that were parts of the same company and its subdivisions. And they were located in relatively close proximity. Think of Michigan in the upper Midwest and the automobile industry. Partly it was for transportation, limit transportation costs. Partly it was to be able to move people physically in a short period of time to fix a problem or change a design. But all of that was dramatically altered by the digital revolution. So we can now have extensive divisions of labor, breaking production into dozens or hundreds or thousands of components and constituent processes that could be located anywhere. That was reinforced by a period of low energy costs, which meant low transportation costs. to move components around and to assemble things, even at great distances, from the major markets in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The changes that came about were also a result of the cumulative effects of US environmental, safety, and other regulations, generally and certainly by me thought to be very good, a good idea. Cleaning up American air, cleaning up the water, protecting the soil from chemical contamination and the like. All of these protect our country, our people, kind of reforms cost money, or increased production costs, or were interpreted as limiting the profits that companies could achieve. So they began to move things outside of the United States, not just to find cheaper labor, which was a factor, but to avoid regulations, to find more lenient regulatory environments, and or to take advantage of positive inducements offered by other countries. Tax breaks, tax holiday for your first decade of profits, for example, if you will relocate here. Subsidized loans, subsidized utilities for some period of time. Different tax systems that made it possible for companies to assign costs and profits on in stages of production to locations that had low taxes, and to assign the proportion of the value added in the high tax countries, of which the United States was perceived to be one, to assign the portion of value added, a very low number, very low percentage. So all of these things kind of came together and encouraged, enabled firms to put profits ahead of other considerations. And those considerations included impact on local communities, impact on workers, impact on education. I'm not attempting to depict companies as malevolent actors. They're not, by and large. They do exactly what they were designed to and are expected to do, which is maximize profits for shareholders. And they do a very good job at that. It's not their job to create jobs in a particular community, or to shape the education system in a local community to ensure that people will obtain the skills needed to persuade companies to stay in that location. It's easier to move to a place. Example is auto industry moving from the US to Canada to take advantage of the Canadian national health system. That it's not nearly as expensive for companies to pay workers on the Canadian side of the border, because healthcare is much less expensive than it is in the United States. And you can take those examples and multiply them many times to understand what's going on. But there are other strands in this phenomenon, in the argument. And another of them was the success of US Cold War policies that were designed and did strengthen our allies and partners. We did this with a combination of providing disproportionate military protection, think the nuclear umbrella, plus extensive asymmetric or unreciprocated access to US markets, technologies, and capital. We had lots of all of these things. We were the leader in all of these things. We didn't simply sit back on our laurels and say, we're the greatest. We used them. We used them to strengthen our partners. And part of it was a pretty straightforward logic that if we transferred technology to our allies, they could strengthen their economy. With a stronger economy, they could support a stronger military. And as they had stronger economies, their people would become more prosperous. And more prosperous people in allied countries would buy more stuff from us. We become richer as they became richer. And this approach, which was followed for 70 years, worked extremely well. We remained safe and secure. We avoided wars with other major powers. We managed to control the danger of nuclear weapons. Our country became much, much wealthier. And for a few decades, our people became much, much wealthier through this, while enabling our allies to do the same. What happened after 1992, we kept in place the same asymmetric opportunities, but it jumped from a couple dozen countries to 170 additional countries, more or less. And that magnitude changed the impact on our country and on perceptions of our place in the international system. The US dominated world that brought greater prosperity and globalization changed a number of key parameters. Among them was the decline in the number and the centrality of defense industries in the United States. That we once had a great many industries that relied primarily on making technological advances and producing advanced weaponry for the United States military and our allies. A lot of the companies in Silicon Valley got their start with contracts from the Defense Department. But one of the consequences of the expansion of the global marketplace to include more or less all countries and more or less all people, and the advantages of digital manufacturing that facilitates very rapid production and modification of products, made the civilian market far more attractive than the military market. And company after company dropped out of the defense production game. And one illustration will, I think, underscore the point that the major high-tech companies that are based here in the Valley roll out new product lines every 6 to 12 months, have significant changes in what they're manufactured. And there's a segment of our population that must have the newest and the greatest, and will pay ever increasing prices for them. The military sector designs equipment on the assumption they're going to use it for 3 decades. Whether it's airplanes or ships or armor or other kinds of equipment. The plan is you got to have supply lines open. You got to be able to keep this stuff in the field for decades. Well, if you can make a lot more money with rapid product turnover, you don't want to keep production lines open to grind out components now for 1980s designed equipment. So they simply dropped out of it, and it changed the structure of the industry. US national power and our military strength has been predicated for decades on maintaining technical superiority. The Soviet Union had a whole lot more of everything. We countered that with, we're going to have everything be better than what they've got. We'll produce less of it, but it'll be better. And part of the difference in that philosophy is actually visible on the TV news at night now, with handheld Javelin missiles able to disable Russian armor. And the Russian armor now is mostly designed in the days of the Soviet Union. That it's a different approach, but the importance of technology to American security has been well understood and facilitated for decades, but it's getting harder to maintain that philosophy and approach. Another of the things that came together, and this is in the last 15 years, is retrenchment and renewed focus on domestic problems after 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not an exaggeration to say the American public is tired of overseas conflict. Ask, why are we fighting these remote wars? How does it affect my security? How does it affect my prosperity? How does it affect my opportunities and the opportunities of my kids and grandchildren? And it is the case that we neglected a lot of dimensions of our domestic society and economy through much of the Cold War, and particularly in the last 30 years, when the mantra of the Tea Party movement to hold down taxes, the smaller government, the government's the problem, and we allowed many things to deteriorate, not just roads and bridges and sewage plants and ports and airports, but schools, our healthcare system, our pharmaceutical distribution mechanism, and the like. So we've got a growing sense in the US that we have to address a host of social problems, and inequality and social justice are aggregating a concept here. They mean different things or entail different things for different groups, but they come together. And I think the easiest way to understand what this is Bernie Sanders. This is the Bernie revolution, the progressive calls for particular kinds of change. But it also increased attention to economic, technological, and military capabilities of other countries. Trump, the economic nationalist more broadly, and what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, which has been correctly, in my view, extended to mean to be the military-industrial congressional complex, that has a very strong vested interest in maintaining much of the system that got put in place to fight the Cold War against a country that no longer exists. So that if the rationale no longer exists, what's the rationale for refusing to make changes? But how do we maintain the US technological advantage, which is an economic advantage and a security advantage, in a world that has become globalized, where technologies are developed and deployed without reference to borders, where even the most sophisticated of products coming into the United States or assembled in the United States are likely to have important components manufactured someplace else. And it's not just the highly sophisticated products. It's a few years since I ran into this example, and I can no longer vouch that it's still accurate, but it was at the time. Among the commodities on which the United States was 100% dependent on imports was fasteners, nails, bolts, screws. You can't build many things without fasteners. And we imported 100% of them. We haven't forgotten how to make nuts and bolts, but we don't. Could we? Should we? Would it be prudent to have that capacity in the United States? That's part of the argument for an industrial policy. Developments that have contributed to the urgency include disruption of supply chains. These supply chains that spread across many countries, often multiple continents, have been disrupted. And the private sector has been remarkably slow to compensate or reduce vulnerability to natural disasters. The tsunami that hit Japan a decade ago that knocked out all Toyota production in the world because it knocked out the one factory that made a critical component. The flooding in Thailand that knocked out 80% of hard drive manufacturing capability. The lack of ready availability of protective equipment in the early months of the COVID pandemic, as we were importing most of this stuff. The impact of sanctions that we're watching play out right now. We're doing this to Russia. What if somebody else did it to the United States for whatever reasons? No, they couldn't succeed over the long run, but in the near term could inflict a lot of pain in the way that the Arab oil embargoes of 1973 and 1979 caused the then huge spike and long lines for gas. This spike in prices and lines at the gas station. So the US, because of the success of globalization and our Cold War policies, is very much interdependent with other parts of the world. And now such interdependence is increasingly seen as unacceptably risky. We have to do things to reduce our vulnerability, to preserve our national strength, to ensure that we can protect healthcare workers in the next pandemic, just to stick with that illustration. And one more factor that comes into play, or one more that I will cite, and that's the rise of so-called peer competitors. Other countries that are thought to be rivaling, if not capable of overtaking the United States in some economic measure, size of GDP, domination of particular biological, chemical, electronic industries and the like that are fundamental or foundational for economy and defense. And the three principal peer competitors are Japan, Europe, and China. One seldom hears reference to Japan as a peer competitor anymore because of the stalling of its economy. But in the 90s, I'm sure you remember Japan as number one, the smashing of Sony TVs on the steps of the Capitol, the demands for export restrictions on Japanese cars into the United States, and Europe. Europe as the European Union has a lot more people and a bigger economy than the United States does. But Japan and the nations of Europe are partners, are allies. We share interests, we share values to a large extent. So they're not characterized as peer competitors. They're characterized as key players in the multi-nation production and supply chains that give the free world its strength. The outlier is China. China is not an ally. It doesn't share the same interests and values. It shares some, but certainly not all. It's very different in ideology. It's very different in its political and economic structure. And it's big. It's 4.5 times as many people as the United States. It will have a bigger economy simply because it has more people. It now has a much more capable military. So we need a rival in order to galvanize action or to justify expenditures to rebuild the militaries that have been, our military, depleted by 20 years of war. You have to design and build for some specific enemy, and there is no candidate except China. For a while, it looked like Russia might be kind of a second motivator, but poor performance in Ukraine has shifted the focus back to China. If we're going to spend $1 trillion a year on defense, we can't claim that we're doing this because of a danger from Iran or North Korea and maintain without smiling with that kind of claim. All of the competitors, in the way that I've structured it, have more explicit industrial policies than the United States does. We have one. We have them, industrial policies, but not identified as such for historical and ideological and political reasons. But the part of the incentive for us to look at the way we do things is we can see quite clearly that others that we are defining as competitors have them and are doing as well, in some respects, doing better. Certainly doing better in Japan and Europe on the social justice and equality kind of dimension. China does worse than we do, but I don't think we want to make China a role model for the United States. Debate became heated. It's become partisan. And it's increasingly cast in national security terms. All of these disparate dimensions of the government economy interaction have been overly squeezed into a national security framework. One reason is, even in our paralyzed political system, we're still more able to get things done in the national security arena than in every other one. Who can be against national security? The national security system that we have in the United States is one of the principal redistribution mechanisms that we have for shifting money from rich states to poor states, rich parts of states to poorer parts of states. Again, I have no problem with that. We're all in the same country. But we did this initially in the name of broad distribution of the vulnerability of our defense industrial complex, so that nobody could attack all of the places that manufactured tanks or canteens or uniforms or anti-aircraft guns. It's spread out, but also we did it so the communities would not bear the full brunt of extra cost in schools or fire departments because there are military bases nearby and families living in the community. It was all rational as it turned out. But as it became impossible to secure budgets and policies in so many other areas, we put more and more things into the security basket. And one reason we spend so much on defense is there's a lot in the defense budget that belongs somewhere else. But changing that is going to be very, very difficult. As China becomes the obvious inevitable rival, we get the debate framed in terms of the return to great power competition, the rise of new rivals who compete technologically, economically with us. A sense that our constrained federal government has proven unable to meet growing public demand for all kinds of things. We need additional authority, capacity, and revenues. There's an increasing sentiment in the US public. But among the ironic contradictions here, as American public, we want more stuff, more benefits, more services, but we don't want to pay any more for it. And among the major industrial countries, we are the lowest taxed country in the world. A smaller segment of our incomes go to taxes to do stuff than in any of the rivals, the other highly successful, highly advanced countries. We can afford it, but we choose not to do that. That the partisan character of the debate that has become tribal, has become in part sharp demarcation between Republican and Democrat parties, where winning is everything and compromise to find a workable solution is unacceptable to both sides in this tribal competition. That we de facto have a situation where both think it's better to lose and maintain the purity of the position than it is to ameliorate some of the very serious problems that our country faces, including those that fall under the rubric of industrial policy. We are beginning to talk about, and maybe Biden, both in his budget and in legislation passed so far, is making a start. Increase money for research and development. For decades, since Reagan, we've reduced the amount of federal money for this, relying more on the private sector. Tax cuts for corporations and the rich were justified in part because they'd spend the money more wisely than government bureaucrats, and we would get more bang for the buck out of research and development of new products and processes. Well, it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. And those that are concerned about increased vulnerability and losing our technological edge now argue that we must reverse the decades of beggaring or underfunding education, research, money to translate laboratory advances into commercial products and to produce those products in the United States. Producing a lot of products in the United States is now difficult because we don't have a large enough skilled workforce. We aren't ever again going to be producing large numbers of shoes and electric fans and those kinds of things that require low skill, repetitive tasks. We've got to have more education of workers in the trades, electricians, plumbers, people able to maintain the computer systems that operate the robots in the precision manufacturing facilities that are going to take far fewer people but require much better educated people. We need more retraining. We need more childcare to free up more people to be in the workforce and the like. The debate has become very confused because of contradictory objectives. We want more federal funding for a lot of the dimensions of what could be called industrial policy, but we don't want a larger government. We don't want a larger government role, or some of us don't. And some of us don't want more taxes in order to make available more money to do the things that are almost certainly necessary, and they are desirable. Recognition that the United States benefits and has benefited enormously from brain drain in other countries. We've got the best universities in the world. We attract the best students from around the world. Many of them stay here. That roughly 60% of the recent winners of American citizen winners of the Nobel Prizes in science engineering are immigrants. More than 50% of the new ventures, entrepreneurial startup companies in that are started by immigrants. And yet we've had this marked opposition to immigration. How can you want to benefit from brain drain while at the same time restricting immigration to the country? It makes the United States not any longer the most desirable destination, but an undesirable destination. Because even if you can get in, we've got social justice problems, the anti-Asian hate of the last year being an illustration. I could go on and elaborate on some of this, but I'm going to stop with a few concluding remarks and open it up to the questions and comments that you've had. One is that continuing to do what we've been doing, even though it was successful for a long time, makes no sense. It's not working, and it actually hasn't worked for a couple of decades. It took us a while to recognize that it had stopped working. Think of it as akin to, the terrific clothes that you bought for your kid to start school in the kindergarten or the first grade. They're still nice clothes, but they don't fit a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old. We've got to recognize the need to do different things. There are no easy solutions, but it is possible to identify some absolutely essential requisites. And these include somehow overcoming the partisan tribalism and refusal to compromise that is the bane of our political system now. It disadvantages everybody except the extraordinarily rich, for whom perpetuation of the status quo works just fine. We've got to drop the use of stigmatizing or dog whistle kind of terminology to discredit ideas. The idea that the government should play a role should not automatically be discredited with a label. Look at exactly what is proposed and see how it might be modified, why it's worth a try, how it's worked in other places. And finally, using the political system, the power of the ballot, local organization, grassroots power, to break the power of entrenched interests. We're not going to do anything different or differently if we continue to vest disproportionate power, political power, as well as financial power, in the hands of people who have no particular interest in changing the existing system. Let me stop there, turn it over to Lou to monitor questions and take this wherever you want to go.
Thank you very much, Tom. First question from Jim. If government enterprises are inherently inefficient, is that inefficiency inversely correlated with the size of the government?
It's a good question, but I think the answer is no. But let me start with the inherently inefficient. It depends on what the criteria are for efficiencies. That governments have to do a lot of things that private sector organizations do not. It has to maintain a lot of what I'll call fire extinguisher capabilities, that it has to be ready for disruptions, for crises of whatever making, natural disaster, something like the pandemic, responding to a military conflict, as is happening now in Ukraine. There need to be people and capacities that are ready to go. You can't invent a capacity once the crisis hits. As we tried to do for Hurricane Katrina back in the Bush administration, where FEMA was simply not equipped to deal with a storm of that magnitude. And we know with a very high degree of certainty that because of global warming, storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like, are going to be both more frequent and more severe. So we're going to have more capacity. And that capacity to respond when you need to looks like inefficiency, while the PPE for dealing with a health crisis is sitting in a warehouse. Why aren't you just turning this stuff over all of the time and say, because you need to have it in case you get to a situation where you need to have it. And part of it that drove me nuts in the time I was in government was the procedures to protect against malfeasance and misuse of the taxpayers' money. That it's a real example. I argued when I had a position with about 20 people working for me, and my discretionary budget was about $1 million to cover all kinds of stuff in that I needed some truly discretionary money, a slush fund that I could use to pay for cab fares. If somebody had to go to a meeting across town or to buy a magazine that had an article that was relevant to it. I said, I don't need much, $200 a month is fine for this. Because at the time, to reimburse a $6 cab ride cost $80 to move the paper through the bureaucracy with all the checks to make sure that nobody was going to steal $6. And I can understand how that comes about, but it is kind of crazy. And it's certainly inefficient. Now, how this relates to size, the need for the latent capacity to deal with problems that you don't have every day. That it's not a matter usually that You can go hire more people to drive snowplows when it snows. That the skill level or the clearances or understanding of how particular pieces of state or local bureaucracies work or just don't allow for that instantaneous beef up capacity. So there are, on any given day, there are more people than are working on current problems. The hope, and I think the reality most of the time, is that they're working on emergency procedures so that when they're needed, they've exercised the capacity in the same way that the military does. Now, why is our military so big? Well, one reason is 20% of it at any given moment is in training. Okay, we've made the decision that in the federal government as a whole, it's way, way less than 1% at any one time being in training. So you've got to have them doing on-the-job training and what looks like busy work. So the perception doesn't square with the reality. I hope that got at the question. Lou?
Thanks. Next one's from Marcia. To offset the effects of globalization on blue-collar jobs in the United States, don't we have to adopt at least some of the quote unquote managed central controls of countries like China to make sure that we're providing job opportunities to the lower middle class who used to be able to buy a home and raise a family without a fancy degree?
That these are serious problems that are pointed to, that historically we handled them with a relationship between a factory, which is probably locally owned, the local community, the schools that serve the local community, to provide the workforce with the particular skills needed by that enterprise, which generated the tax revenue for the local government. It was a kind of a closed loop that worked. But as technology and opportunities made it possible to pursue economies of scale, divisions of labor, higher efficiency, and higher profits by moving elsewhere, or by moving a portion of the activity elsewhere, those relationships were broken. Companies seldom or decreasingly often operate as if they have a high degree of responsibility for the health of the communities in which they are located. In there, that the globalization phenomenon is a result of changes that cause companies or labeled companies to move out of localities, and the failure of governments to step in to retrain workers, or to have more sensible policies. For purposes of debate, we'll start with simple-minded proposals. It makes more sense to me to buy the house from somebody whose mortgage is underwater and move them to where there are jobs than it does to pay them unemployment to stay in the same house, which will stay underwater for an indefinite period. That to retrain people for more advanced jobs, that we've got plenty of workers that are smart enough because of the general education that we have. Our secondary education is not total disaster in most places. So they've got the basic numeracy and language skills to learn the skills needed to manage more sophisticated machinery. So we need training programs. It's the kind of thing the Europeans do that we haven't. Apprenticeship programs, paying people to move from point A to point B. Some companies do this, not enough of them do it. What partnership, a public-private partnership to do these things? It's not, the Chinese on most of these things are pretty bad. They're as bad or worse than we are, in my judgment. It's not a role model from handling these questions. The inequalities there are terrible. The education system for half the people that live in the rural areas is terrible. And it doesn't prepare people for the better jobs in the cities, and which is why they've got a rising cost of workers problem, because the flow into the jobs is dried up on it. But the idea that the government has a role and a responsibility to play is not questioned in China. It's expected by the public. That in the United States, there's a big chunk of our public that has grown up with the disparagement of government, the disparagement of anything other than pure market capitalism, which we've never actually had in the United States, because it's just too brutal, and recognized as such. There's a need to sand off the rough edges of pure pursuit of profit. And that's where government laws and regulations come into play. But we've had now almost four decades of continuous disparagement of a role for government. And in that, we are unique in the world, and certainly unique among the highly developed countries and in those that are now described as the great power rivals of the US.
All right, we have a follow-up comment from Jim. So based on your prior answer, it would seem that larger government entities with a larger scope of responsibilities would seem to be less efficient than smaller, for example, town or city governments, because the larger governments require more of the quote unquote fire extinguishers to handle unforeseen events.
I don't think that's right. That again, I don't claim to have the solution to all these problems, but there are things that we have left at the level of local government, because that's where it started out, our frontier nation and self-reliance and the like, and our constitutional structure, which specifies certain things to the federal government. Everything else is left to the people in the states. At state level, it's certain things are specified, everything else is left to the localities and the people. But let's take the response to COVID-19 as an illustration there. And I have poked at this a little bit under one of my hats in the Institute for Science for Global Policy and project on preparing for the next pandemic, that public health officials, most places, are not the best and the brightest. I mean, we are lucky we live in an area that has some of the most talented, most capable people and capacity in public health. We also are fortunate to live in one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. Most places are not as well endowed with these resources. And the confusion about what to do, the lack of credibility of statements from public health officials, the difficulty getting compliance with simple things like wash your hands, social distance, and wear a mask, let alone become vaccinated to protect yourself and your family, is a function of the way we've structured the system, the duplication we have in the system, that we're going to keep costs down. So a lot of them don't have professional medical people, and these are political appointees who are in the job. It's part-time. And it's like, you get what you pay for. We have education system is another one. We still fund education as if teaching was to be the occupation of the unmarried woman from the village, and wasn't going to need much money because she's probably going to get married sooner or later anyway. So we underpay people in our education system and are surprised when the products of that education system don't meet the requirements of the economy in lots of places in our country. Having a system, I have asked a question early in the pandemic of one of my medical colleagues at Stanford, is something like this manageable without a far more effective national health system? And his answer was instantaneous. It's not. There's simply not a way to coordinate. And you get a lot more inefficiency and duplication when every locality is reinventing the wheel. And I'm not sure how, I simply don't know what the number of localities is, but I know what the number of police departments is in the United States, because I had to deal with that at one point, and it's 18,000. And I guess that's probably a pretty good proxy number for how many local government jurisdictions do we have. So you got 18,000 opportunities to get it right or wrong, to fund it adequately or inadequately, and to do something different than the jurisdiction next door, causing confusion about, well, what do I do? Who do I listen to in this? So it's not a simple, more functions is more people. It depends on what level and how integrated they are and to whom they are accountable. None of which is mapped out in advance here.
Yeah.
Lou?
So that is the end of our questions. So I will say on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much. As usual, it was very enlightening and very informative, and oh, by the way, challenging. So we come away with lots of things here that we oh, here we have, sorry, we have a late entry here.
Okay.
If half the population in larger cities in China, if half the population in larger cities is becoming competitively educated, then do also the larger number of people in China have maybe produced more globally educated? I don't understand this question. Sorry. If half the population in larger cities in China is becoming competitively educated, then do the larger number of people in China have maybe produced more globally educated people in China? I'm sorry. I
mean, I think I understand the question, which I've just looked at it in the chat. That it can boil down is, China's got so many people, and if half of them live in cities and they're getting a pretty good education, doesn't that factor alone leave them in a very strong competitive position? Yes, in some regards. An argument I've been making for decades is that we can't not cooperate with what was 1/4, it's now 1/7. 17% of the global population lives in China. You can't ignore 17% of the global brains and expect to solve a lot of difficult problems. We have, for the last 40 years, picked off a significant percentage of the best and brightest in China. They've come here to study. A tiny fraction of them who stay through graduate study go back. They may go back eventually, but right now, like folks coming from every other country in the world, a lot of them stay, and we benefit because they see more opportunities to pursue their professional interests, and they like the ambiance, they like the freedom, they like the opportunity that is us. That yes, we've got a lot of blemishes in our society, but compared to China on a lot of things, we're pretty designed. And it's not only China that is in this. The flip side of China's got 17% or 1/7 of the world's population. They are now, as a matter of policy, pursuing autarky, extreme self-reliance. They want to train and utilize their own people in all dimensions of all of the advanced technologies. And if I'm right, that we can't master all of these things if we ignore 1/7 of the world's brain power, I don't think China is going to be successful keeping out 6/7 of the world brain power in this. That nationalism as a rationale for maintaining a closed education system, that we can make it even better if we keep out the outsiders, whether they're from another country or they're from another state. Our state systems once upon a time were a lot more exclusive than they are now. Now they want out-of-state students because they pay more tuition, and states put less money in the state system. So I go on at the length because none of these things are straightforward, clear cut. Will China have a bigger GDP than the United States? The answer is, of course it will, because GDP is a function of how many people you have. Number of people times the amount of work that they do. And 1.4 billion people only have to do a little bit of work each to get a very big number. That the human capital dimension is when the Chinese are making progress. Lots of folks are making progress. We've got to make more progress. We can't simply say for decades we've been the best ever, the best in the world, and try to prevent others from catching up by holding them back. We got to keep going forward on it. We've got to do better. We can do better. And that's the rationale for some of the elements that go into what's called an industrial policy. Training people for future jobs, which we've done primarily by trying to inculcate general skills, general education knowledge that now includes, of course, a lot of familiarity with programming and computers and the like. As once upon a time, it was arithmetic and English, so that people can adjust to job. Most of the world trains for today's jobs. They're training people to come out of school, take a job, and be in that job. But that's not a proven recipe for moving forward. That's the Soviet model that proved to lead to stagnation.
All right. So again, thank you very much. Do you want to give us a little preview of next week?
I do. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And I hope my talk was reasonably coherent. Next week, the subject of the challenges of space, the commercialization of space, the vast increases in the number, now thousands of satellites that are up there performing all kinds of tasks. And our speaker is retired Major General of the Air Force, Jay Santee, who's the Vice President for Strategic Space Operations for the Aerospace Corporation. He's a former Deputy Director of Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He's a friend of several years. I've heard him many, many times on space issues. He's good. And what he has to say, I'm sure will be interesting, and much of it, I'm sure, will surprise you. So thank you all for tuning in, and Lou, back to you to close us out.
All right, so we look forward to that. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point and end the meeting. And again, when the recording is available, we'll send a note out to everybody. And until then, have a great week, and we'll be together again next Sunday. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye all.